Today we'll be talking about endocrinology. So let's just start with some basic concepts in endocrinology. When we talk about endocrinology, we talk about hormones. And these hormones can basically be divided into two categories. The lipid soluble hormones and the water soluble hormones. The lipid soluble hormones and the water soluble hormones. Lipid soluble hormones consists mainly of the steroid hormones and the thyroid hormones, whereas the water soluble hormones consists of peptides, all the peptide hormones and the amines. The peptide hormones and the amines. The lipid hormones, they have cytoplasmic or nuclear receptors. Whereas the water soluble hormones, they have receptors on the cell membrane. So they have the membrane surface receptors. The lipid hormones have a longer half-life and the water soluble hormones have a shorter half-life. They are synthesized as and when needed. Synthesized as and when needed. Exception to this is thyroid hormones, because thyroid hormones are stored, whereas their water soluble hormones are synthesized and stored. Water soluble hormones are synthesized and stored. So lipid soluble hormones mainly consist of the steroid hormones, that is the hormones of the adrenal cortex, the glucocorticoids, the mineralocorticoids, the sex steroids, and the thyroid hormones. And along with that, they also include vitamin A and vitamin D. Vitamin A and D, they also act as hormones. So the hormones of the adrenal cortex, that is the glucocorticoids, the mineralocorticoids, and the sex steroids, the thyroid hormones, vitamin A and vitamin D, all of them are lipid soluble. Whereas the rest of the hormones, like insulin, glucagon, anterior pituitary hormones, all of them which we would be talking about, they are all water soluble hormones. So they act via membrane surface receptors. So you get a lot of questions on the action of hormones. So what you need to remember is the lipid soluble hormones have cytoplasmic or nuclear receptors. Cytoplasmic or nuclear receptors. That is, they're going to go inside the cell and then they would have a receptor in the cytoplasm, and along with the receptor they would bind to the nucleus, they will go into the nucleus, or they would have a receptor on the nucleus. And they usually act by synthesizing new proteins because they go inside the nucleus, and inside the nucleus they initiate transcription and then translation. So new proteins are synthesized. So lipid soluble hormones usually act by synthesis of new proteins. They usually act by synthesizing new proteins. Whereas the water soluble hormones, they have the receptors on the cell membrane. They have the membrane surface receptors. So they need a secondary messenger. So they would need a secondary messenger. So most of them usually need a secondary messenger, and we'll just talk about the secondary messengers. So water soluble hormones, they act via secondary messengers except insulin. Except insulin. So that's another question. So all the other water soluble hormones, they act via secondary messenger except insulin, because insulin's receptor has its own activity. Insulin receptors has its own uh, enzyme activity, that is tyrosine kinase activity, so it does not need a secondary messenger. Okay, it does not need a secondary messenger. So all these points are very important because they'll help you solve a lot of questions on the mechanism of action of hormones. Another thing which I told you when we had our first class, that lipid soluble hormones, how would they enter the cell? Because we just talked that they have cytoplasmic or nuclear receptors. So how do these hormones enter inside the cell? Because they are lipid soluble, they enter by the process of simple diffusion, right? So lipid soluble hormones enter inside the cell by the process of simple diffusion. That is a pretty straightforward question which is sometimes asked. So you should know that. Let's look at the various hormones and their mechanism of action. So this is a big list. We would not try to memorize the whole list. You may if you want to, but I don't think that would be very high yield. So we'll just try to remember the most important points from this list. We'll try to remember the most important points from this list. We have just talked about that all the steroid hormones, they act via cytoplasmic or nuclear receptors. So what are the various steroid hormones? I told you the adrenocortical hormones, that is the glucocorticoids, the mineralocorticoids. So glucocorticoid mainly is cortisol, mineralocorticoid is aldosterone, the sex steroids, testosterone, estrogens, progesterone, the thyroid hormones, T3, T4, and vitamin D. Also, you can add here vitamin A. So all these act via intracellular receptor. So if we can just remember this, we can rule out a lot of questions, a lot of options, and that would help us in getting to the correct option. So this you need to remember properly. You cannot afford to not remember this. This is very important, and all of them are lipid soluble. All of them are lipid soluble. We just discussed that. Okay. Other than that, what you need to remember, there are only three things which act via cyclic GMP. Cyclic GMP is a secondary messenger. So brain natriuretic peptide, atrial natriuretic peptide, and EDRF, that is nitric oxide. These are the only three things which act via cyclic GMP. So yes, we can remember that. Okay. Then I told you that insulin does not need a secondary messenger. So insulin has the receptor of insulin has its own tyrosine kinase activity. So this you can remember about insulin. This is very important. And then sometimes they would ask you the hormones acting via cyclic AMP, right? So usually I have seen in the questions glucagon, they ask about glucagon, so remember that. They ask about glucagon, so remember that. I think if you remember the highlighted things, you should be able to solve all the questions. If you just remember whatever I've highlighted here, you should be able to solve the questions, right? Because we don't need to remember all of this. The highlighted part should be good enough to answer the questions. Okay. Now we can keep a note of things. If we get some other questions while doing it, so we'll have a look. But just try and remember all the highlighted things, and you should be good to go. I can give you mnemonics for this if someone wants to remember all of them, but I don't think that is necessary. But still, I'll give you mnemonics for remembering them. So for cyclic AMP, it's flat, champ, chugs. Uh, if you just see the red part in the question, sorry, in the list, you should be. So for cyclic AMP is U is silent here, as in there's nothing from U. So this is the mnemonic for cyclic AMP. I don't think it's needed, but you can still have it if you want. Then for IP3 it's goat hag. Then this I think you don't need a mnemonic because this I've already told you. I think that should be enough. That should be enough. Not more than this is needed. Not more than this is needed. Okay, let's continue and let's talk about the hypothalamic pituitary axis. Let's talk about the hypothalamic pituitary axis. Before that, a little more thing which I would want to tell you is that the lipid soluble hormones, they are usually attached to proteins. The lipid soluble hormones, the lipid soluble hormones, they are attached to proteins. So they have a bound form. The lipid soluble hormones have a bound form and they have a free form. The amount of hormone attached to proteins is the bound form and the rest of it is the free form. And the free form is responsible for the activity of the hormone. The free form is responsible for the activity of the hormone, and also it is the free form which is responsible for the negative feedback. The free form which is responsible for the activity of the hormone, and the free form which is responsible for the negative feedback, right? Okay, let's continue and let's talk about the hypothalamic pituitary axis. Let's talk about the hypothalamic pituitary axis. So the hypothalamus has various nuclei and hypothalamus secretes various hormones. The various hormones secreted by the hypothalamus are gonadotrophin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, somatostatin, and dopamine. Dopamine is also known as prolactin inhibiting factor. Dopamine is also known as prolactin inhibiting factor or prolactin inhibiting hormone. Dopamine is also known as prolactin inhibiting factor or prolactin inhibiting hormone, PRIH, PIF, PRIF, something like that. So these four hormones from the hypothalamus, which I have just highlighted, they are formed from the arcuate nucleus. Growth hormone releasing hormone, gonadotrophin releasing hormone, somatostatin, and dopamine, they are secreted from the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus. Whereas CRH and TRH, they are secreted from the paraventricular nucleus. They are secreted from the paraventricular nucleus. So these are the six main hormones. These are the six main hormones which are secreted by the hypothalamus. These are the six main hormones which are secreted by the hypothalamus. And these hormones, they usually act on the anterior pituitary hormone. So let's talk about the hormones of the anterior pituitary. Let's talk about the hormones of the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, as you can see, again has six hormones. So anterior pituitary contains two kinds of cells. The first cells are basophils and the second kind of cells are acidophils. The anterior pituitary contains two kinds of cells, basophils and acidophils. So let's just try and remember two hormones, the growth hormone and prolactin. Growth hormone and prolactin are secreted by the acidophilic cells. Growth hormone and prolactin are secreted by the acidophilic cells, and the rest are secreted by the basophils. So just remember two, remembering two is easier, and the rest four are secreted by the basophils. Growth hormone prolactin secreted by the acidophils, whereas ACTH, LH, FSH, and TSH, they are all secreted by the basophilic cells. They are all secreted by the basophilic cells. Then the cells of the pituitary have various names. I don't think which we need to go into the details, but all you can remember is the cells secreting growth hormones are known as somatotrophs and they are maximum in number. Somatotrophs, these are maximum approximately 50%. So the maximum cells are somatotrophs which secrete growth hormone. The cells secreting TSH are thyrotrophs, the cells secreting, right? So there are various cells like this. We don't need to remember all of them. We just need to remember that somatotrophs secrete growth hormone and they are maximum in number. 50% are somatotrophs. Okay, let's try and talk about them a little bit. So CRH released from the hypothalamus stimulates the release of ACTH from the anterior pituitary. Stimulates the release of ACTH from the anterior pituitary. And this ACTH, also known as adrenocorticotrophic hormone. So this basically acts on the adrenal cortex. This basically acts on the adrenal cortex. So this is straightforward, no confusion here. Then gonadotrophin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus stimulates the production of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. It stimulates the production of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, and prolactin prolactin inhibits the release of gonadotrophin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Prolactin inhibits the release of gonadotrophin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and this is the reason that breastfeeding during breastfeeding prolactin is increased, which inhibits the release of gonadotrophin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and thus it leads to decrease in levels of LSH and FSH, which leads to delayed postpartum ovulation. Delayed postpartum ovulation, which is also known as lactational amenorrhea. So it acts as a natural contraception for the mother post delivery. Postpartum means post delivery. Post delivery, there is natural contraception high levels of because of high levels of prolactin. There is postpartum delayed ovulation, also known as lactational amenorrhea, right? Next, we talk about thyrotrophin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which stimulates the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, and it also stimulates the release of prolactin. It also stimulates the release of prolactin. So its main effect is on the thyroid stimulating hormone, but it is also stimulating prolactin. So again, another thing which you have to remember here is that if TRH is increased due to any cause, we will talk about that. So increased TRH also increases prolactin, and because of which there is hyperprolactinemia. And one of the most important signs of hyperprolactinemia is galactoria. Galactoria is increased milk production, or milk production when it is not needed. Increased prolactin secretion leads to increased milk production, that is known as galactoria. Okay, so whenever TRH is increased, it might lead to hyperprolactinemia, and thus it would lead to galactoria. The next we would talk about is growth hormone releasing hormone, which stimulates the release of growth hormone. Another hormone, somatostatin, which is also sometimes known as growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Somatostatin inhibits the release of growth hormone, as the name suggests, and it also inhibits the release of TSH. Somatostatin also inhibits the release of TSH, right? And lastly, we're going to talk about dopamine, which is also sometimes known as prolactin inhibiting hormone. I've already told you, which inhibits the release of prolactin. So normally the release of prolactin is kept under check. As you can see, all the other hormones mainly are stimulating the anterior pituitary hormones, but the release of prolactin is kept under check normally by dopamine, right? This is also known as prolactin inhibiting factor. This is also known as prolactin inhibiting factor. Then another thing which you need to know is that all the pituitary hormones except TSH All the pituitary hormones except TSH, they are released in a pulsatile fashion. They are released in a pulsatile fashion. So all pituitary hormones except TSH are released in a pulsatile fashion. Okay. Then if there is a lesion here, if there is a lesion here, that is sometimes also referred to as the, you might get a question when there is transaction of pituitary stalk. Transaction of pituitary stalk. So when there's a transaction of pituitary stalk, what would happen? The level of all anterior pituitary hormones, would decrease except prolactin. Prolactin would increase because normally prolactin is kept under check. So there is a question which says that which of the following hormones increases after a lesion of the pituitary stalk, or which of the following hormones increases after there is a transaction of the pituitary stalk. Or they might give you a clinical vignette in which, say, a person was going on a bike, he had an accident, they did an MRI or a CT or something, and they found a lesion of the pituitary stalk. Which hormone would be found increased in this person? Something of that sort, right? So when there is transaction of the pituitary stalk, there is increase in levels of prolactin. There is increase in levels of prolactin. And all the hormones are secreted in pulsatile fashion except TSH. Except TSH. Right? And I've also told you the maximum number of cells are the ones secreting growth hormone, which are known as somatotrophs. Which are known as somatotrophs. These are approximately 50% in number. And the minimum ones are thyrotropes. They might ask you minimum as well. So minimum are thyrotropes. And these two are acidophilic. The rest four are secreted from the basophils. Right? Let's talk about each hormone one by one. We'll cover all the important hormones. We'll try and cover all the important hormones. So let's begin with growth hormone. Let's begin with growth hormone. We have already discussed that growth hormone is secreted from the anterior pituitary. Growth hormone is secreted from the anterior pituitary, and growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus